Hey folks, it's Felix McPhalen over here. It's a Thursday, and I wanted to do a very short, very brief study on the 7 kingdoms of Daniel chapter 2. You remember that Nebuchadnezzar had that dream, and then he called in Daniel to interpret the dream, and then Daniel said, verse 31, he said,
Thou, O king, sawest, and behold, a great image. This great image, whose brightness was excellent, stood before thee, and the form thereof was terrible. This image's head was of fine gold, his breast and his arms of silver, his belly and his thighs of brass, his legs of iron, his feet part of iron and part of clay. Thou sawest till that a stone was cut out without hands, which smote the image upon his feet that were of iron and clay, and brake them to pieces. Then was the iron, the clay, the brass, the silver, and the gold broken to pieces together, and became like the chaff of the summer threshing floors. And the wind carried them away, that no place was found for them, and the stone that smote the image became a great mountain, and filled the whole earth.
So he gave the interpretation, and starting in verse 37, he said, Thou, O king, art a king of kings, for the God of heaven hath given thee a kingdom, power, and strength, and glory. And he goes on to say in the next verse, he said, Thou art this head of gold, and after thee shall arise another kingdom inferior to thee, and another third kingdom of brass, which shall bear rule over all the earth.
And the fourth kingdom shall be strong as iron, for as much as iron breaketh in pieces and subdueth all things, and as iron that breaketh all these shall it break in pieces and bruise. And whereas thou sawest the feet and toes, part of potter's clay and part of iron, the kingdom shall be divided. But there shall be in it of the strength of the iron, for as much as thou sawest the iron mixed with miry clay, and as the toes of the feet were part of iron and part of clay, so the kingdom shall be partly strong and partly broken. And whereas thou sawest iron mixed with miry clay, they shall mingle themselves with the seed of men, but they shall not cleave one to another, even as iron is not mixed with clay. And in the days of these kings shall the God of heaven set up a kingdom which shall never be destroyed, and the kingdom shall not be left to other people, but it shall break in pieces and consume all these kingdoms, and it shall stand forever.
So what he's talking about is he's talking about 6 kingdoms, 6 earthly kingdoms, followed by a 7th kingdom that comes from heaven. So you have, of course, the image's head, that's gold, that's going to be the Babylonians. Then you have the breast and arms of silver, it's going to be the Medes and Persians. Then you have the belly and the thighs of brass, that's going to be the Grecians. Then you have the legs of iron, the Romans. Feet, part of iron and part of clay. That's where you start getting the different interpretations, because the early church fathers, Irenaeus, Hippolytus, and others, they always taught development of these feet are still future. And then, of course, you have the entire image reconstituted, which is the 6th kingdom. Because it says in verse 35, then was the iron, the clay, the brass, the silver, and the gold broken to pieces together. So the whole image has to be reconstituted at the time of the end. We saw that the Romans were in dominion during the time of Christ, and then the Roman Empire sort of piddled away throughout the next few centuries and was eventually swallowed up by the Goths and the Vandals and all of them. And it sort of just broke off into different nations, different countries, and so forth. But what we have right here is we have a further development and a future development of these 2 feet, part of iron and part of clay. Now, I'm not going to get into the whole issue of what it means with, when it says in verse 43, and they shall mingle themselves with the seed of men. I believe that has something to do with demonic powers mingling with the human race, but I don't know that for sure. It's just a hunch. Anyhow, what's going to happen is these 10 kings have to arise, and Irenaeus saw this as future, that the 10 kings must arise first, and then of course there's going to be another king that arises after them. It's going to defeat those 3 of those kings, and then it's going to become 8th of the 7. We get that imagery in Revelation. Of course, that's going to allow that image to be reconstituted. All of those kingdoms and all of those nations are going to be reconstituted. It's going to be a worldwide government, and of course it's going to be headed by the beast. Now, something to consider right now is that this is the anti-type of Goliath. Remember that Goliath stood up to defy the living God, and David came out against him and of course killed him with that sling stone. It's the same thing. Jesus Christ, who is the true David, is going to defeat the true Goliath. This is going to happen at the end of the age, and that's partially what Revelation's about. That's what the prophecies of Daniel are about, and these things can all be borne out if we study these prophecies in order. Going to Daniel chapter 7, because here's another prophecy which is parallel. He said in verse 2, Daniel spoke and said, I saw in my vision by night, and behold, the 4 winds of the heavens strove upon the great sea. And 4 great beasts came up from the sea, diverse one from another. The first was like a lion and had eagle's wings. So that's going to be, of course, your Babylonians, right? And I said in verse 5, it says, and behold, another beast, a second like to a bear. And that's going to be your Medes and your Persians. Verse 6, after this I beheld, and lo, another, like a leopard, which had upon the back of it 4 wings of a fowl. It's going to be your Grecians, which were divided into 4 after Alexander's death. And then, of course, after that, he says in verse 7, after this I saw in night visions, and behold, a 4th beast. That's going to be your Romans. Now, here's where it gets interesting, because he said that the 4th beast, it had great iron teeth, it devoured and brake in pieces and stamped a residue with the feet of it. It was diverse from all the beasts that were before it, and had 10 horns. So that's going to be your 10 toes. I considered the horns, and behold, there came up among them another little horn, before whom there were 3 of the first horns plucked up by the roots, and behold, in this horn were eyes like the eyes of a man, and mouth speaking great things. Then he says, I beheld till the thrones were cast down, the Ancient of Days did sit, whose garment was white as snow. His throne was like the fiery flame, and his wheels as burning fire. And of course, this is parallel with Revelation, chapters 4 and 5. So we're not going to read the whole thing, but it's the same thing, because when you go to Revelation chapter 13, you're going to see this, that all of these kingdoms that Daniel was talking about are now reconstituted. So when you go to Revelation chapter 13, you get that composite view. You could say that there's going to be your 5th kingdom is going to be that 10 horns, and then the final kingdom is going to be the reconstituted composite form, put back together by the beast of Revelation 13, by the beast that comes from the sea. So it's the same thing. It's one prophecy, but it's just given from 2 diverse points of view. And, these prophecies, they're interesting in themselves, but what I wanted to say, going back to Daniel chapter 2, broken in pieces together, a lot of interpreters will not allow that word to have its proper weight. For instance, Moses Stewart wrote in his commentary on the book of Daniel, he says, the reader must not suppose that all the 4 monarchies are symbolized here as coexisting and contemporaneous when the final blow is given, violating one of the first principles of interpretation by not allowing the prophecy to speak for itself, by having preconceived notions forced upon the passage. He said the explanation in the sequel shows plainly that they are successive, but they're not successive. He says they're broken in pieces together. Important, very important, and we have to go back to the early interpreters, and they understood this probably a lot better than we do. So I think we can honor their interpretation. We can also honor the Protestant principle of private judgment to the extent that it doesn't conflict with what's been taught for 2,000 years. So since I'm a septimillennialist, and I believe that at the end of the 6,000th year there will be a 1,000-year period of rest known as the millennium, then obviously I take this very, very seriously, because ultimately the 6th kingdom is going to be destroyed. And this is what we see in the book of Revelation, chapter 13, with Antichrist, whose number is 666. You're seeing a concentration of all apostasy and wickedness going back from the time of the flood all the way to the present day. So they're on a fixed timetable. They know they're rushing at breakneck speed to get all this stuff done. National entities need to be broken down so that they can be, these 10 kings can take over and partition the world. And then, of course, that last world leader, a beast, that little horn is going to have to defeat 3 of those kings, and then it's going to have to reconstitute the image, re-weld everything into one. That's going to be your 6th kingdom. And of course, the 7th kingdom is Christ coming from heaven. So very interesting stuff. Didn't want to take up too much time talking about that, but if you look through these prophecies and study them really carefully, you'll see that what I'm saying is the truth. Anyhow, thanks again for tuning in. Thanks for listening. Thanks for subscribing. Thanks for your thoughts, your comments, your observations. You have a wonderful day, and I'll talk to you soon. Bye.